Hey, Future Hindsight fans, we have so much great video content we want to share with you. If you haven't subscribed to our YouTube channel yet, what are you waiting for? Head to youtube.com/Future Hindsight now to subscribe to our channel. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week, I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. There's no question that American democracy is in dire need of reimagining. I would argue we need systems change to make democracy deliver on the economy, education, health, equity, climate change, and more. As it turns out, it's possible to address our society's issues with a win-win-win approach, or multisolving. And to help us unpack how to multisolve, we're joined by Elizabeth Sawin. She's the director of the Multisolving Institute and the author of Multisolving, Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World. Beth developed the concept of multisolving after studying bright spots around the world where people created systems change by building connections across silos, addressing equity, climate change, health, well-being, and economic vitality as integrated issues. Welcome, Beth. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So I mentioned that we need systems change, and I know you agree, but just to ground our conversation here today, let's go over the basic terminologies. For the everyday person, please explain, what is systems thinking?
Yeah, systems thinking is a body of knowledge and practices that just acknowledges how interconnected our whole world is. So a system is a collection of interconnected parts. Our bodies are systems, our communities are systems, a school, a neighborhood, these are all systems. And systems have a few characteristics. One is they're connected by feedback loops, which just means a change in one part of a system often affects other parts of the system. And sometimes those changes come back and affect the part where it started. And sometimes that surprises us because those chains of cause and effect can be long, they can be complicated. And both our education and our governance and our policy often neglect that interconnection. So systems thinking tries to help people add more of that in so we can make choices that surprise us less and serve our goals more.
Excellent. So then, as a follow-up in grounding our understanding of the terminologies, what is multisolving and why do we need it?
Yeah, well, multisolving is a simple idea. It's the idea that there's many things we can do that meet multiple needs at the same time. And in our everyday lives, this is pretty common. My grandmother used to organize church suppers in her little town, and that would raise money for the church. It bought produce from local farmers, so it was economic assistance, and it was a place for community connection. So, we go through our days with these things we do where one action meets many needs. And those are kind of obvious to us in our own lives, but it's true for societies as well. And one example is if we were to wean our societies from fossil fuels, we not only would be protecting the climate, but we would be improving everyone's health because so much air pollution is created from fossil fuels, and that makes us sick in lots of ways. We'd be creating new jobs in green energy, so there'd be economic impacts, and so on. So it sounds really obvious, but when you look around the world, there's many places where we don't multi-solve. Instead, we address problems very narrowly. And my colleagues and I feel like there's just a huge opportunity in accessing more of those opportunities to do many things at once. And you asked why, which is a good question. One of the first reasons is just practicality. Like, time and money are very short. The crises we face are very many. So anytime you can accomplish more than one thing at a time, it's a good thing to do in my mind. A second reason is those needs that I'm talking about are on different time scales. So you might have a short-term problem like lots of kids have asthma and a long-term problem like climate change. And one action, say replacing diesel buses with electric school buses, actually helps both of those. And why that matters is sometimes it's really hard to move a whole system for a long-term goal, something that will matter after many of us might not be alive anymore, like climate change is on that time scale. Certainly politicians won't still be in office, but they will be in office as the asthma rate goes down, as the air gets cleaner. So it's a way to sometimes connect long-term and short-term and think about them both in a more integrated way.
Well, so in the context of systems thinking, you just also mentioned that a lot of people think about problem solving as, we're solving one problem here, one problem there, and it's like a direct line and it's very linear. So in the context of systems thinking about American democracy, as we are a democracy show, I think it's also useful to explain the difference between the two worldviews that you mentioned in your book, a collection of objects worldview and the web of relationships worldview. And as you write in the book, these worldviews are deeply embedded in our society. And really, we take them for granted, but they inform so much of how we make decisions. And in the US, of course, we are firmly in the grips of operating within a collection of objects worldview. Tell us more what they are and why they are important.
Yeah, in systems thinking, we pay a lot of attention to worldviews. Sometimes they get called mindsets or paradigms, but they're basically deeply held and, like you said, often unexamined or even unnoticed beliefs about how the world works. So all those connections and systems that I was telling you about, they're usually set up by people who have certain beliefs that they may or may not have looked at. So my teacher, Danella Meadows, wrote a really famous essay about this called Leverage Points, where she says those worldviews are hard to change, but they are also so powerful because everything else in a system changes if what people believe about how the world works and what the purpose of a life is. So there's two worldviews that are in a battle right now in the US, but in the world. And I had to come up with names for them. So I borrowed the words collection of objects from the eco-theologian Thomas Berry. So he describes this worldview where we see the world as not alive. We see each other almost as like objects that bounce off of one another. And it's kind of zero-sum game. I can be safe at your expense, which we get all kinds of oppression, right, coming from that worldview. And in that worldview, there's also this assumption that society is organized in a kind of pyramid. In the US, with white people at the top, white men at the very, very top, perhaps people of color below that, people with disabilities, different types of groups at different access to power, access to safety. So the collection of objects worldview, we have familiar names for it in different contexts. So if we're talking about gender, we might call that patriarchy, right? Where society is organized around the needs of men. If we're talking about the environment, we might call it extractive economics, where the rights of nature aren't considered significant, and it's what does the economy need? If it comes to race, we would talk about white supremacy. So each of those has a kind of similar organizing principle around a different domain. And I think you could pick up any newspaper today and see how a lot of suffering in our society fits into that or evolves from those sets of assumptions. Mm-hmm. If we design an economy as though the earth doesn't matter, then it's not surprising that rivers are polluted and air is polluted and the climate is changing.
And so in contrast to a collections of objects worldview, what's the other one?
There's another worldview, and we all hold parts of it. And some people and some cultures, especially indigenous cultures, are keepers of this worldview. And in the book, I call that a web of relationships worldview. So it sees a web and that we're all connected. And in those same domains, we would replace patriarchy with gender equity. We would replace white supremacy with a multiracial society or racial equity. We would acknowledge the rights of nature. Once I started to see those two worldviews, I saw them everywhere and at all levels. And in myself, we can't be socialized in a society where the collection of objects worldview is so prominent without absorbing some of it in our unconscious thinking. But the opportunity is in little ways, in our relationships, in our organizations. Moment by moment, we can choose to try to stand in the web of relationships worldview. If you believe, and each of us has to assess this, if you think that's a more adaptive, more accurate, like, is that how the world actually works? I think a lot of what we face right now is a society making choices that contradict how the world actually works. Like, get outside of humanity. The global ecosystem is a whole, it's indivisible, it is a web. And so why would you expect a set of beliefs about, certain special groups with certain extra rights to work in a world that isn't organized that way? But what I'm suggesting is, in small ways and bigger ones, we do have choice about which worldview we want to embody, which one we want to disrupt or challenge or ask questions about.
Yeah, thank you for this explanation. So you mentioned that these two worldviews are at war, and I would agree with you. I think right now, prevailing worldviews are changing. People are trying things out or thinking anew about how they make sense of the world, right? Like, people are questioning the primacy of capitalism. And I think it's also plenty clear in the last 3 election cycles that American democracy is on the rocks. How do you think about multisolving for our current political dysfunction?
That is a really big question. I think I would start by saying that the ideal of democracy, of collective governance, has always only been an idea in the United States. It's never been fully practiced. And it has a lot of the collection of objects worldview in it. And you're right, over time, I think there's been this shifting from only property owning white men participated in this collective governance to slowly widening that to include women, but at first only white women, and expanding civil rights. So that is a bit of this interplay of the two worldviews. One thing systems do is they resist change. And so in the US, we had a big change with the first Black president in Barack Obama. And I'm kind of convinced by analysis that says a lot of what we're experiencing now is a system reacting to that shift in a certain direction. Systems push back. And so that, like, sharing power, moving toward a more equitable, multiracial society has unleashed other, we would call them feedback loops. And so, like, doesn't solve anything to see it that way, except that it maybe helps get a little more perspective of systems shift, but they also resist change. And if you are committed to the system being shaped differently, then you have to react to those reactions. And I think, that's what we're all probably called to do right now, is to figure out our own individual, what we're good at, what we have the courage for, what we have the knowledge for, to participate in that contested ground about, is our governance going to be collective, or is it going to come from a very small group of people?
Yeah, it's not necessarily obvious right in this moment what the future is going to look like and what are the things that we need to do to disrupt this cycle. But one of the things that you mentioned in the book is that you have to start thinking ahead so that when the opportunity comes around, you're ready. That's why I have this podcast, and we want to explore these ideas so that when the opportunity comes around, and it's coming, I don't know exactly when, that we can be ready. You just mentioned feedback loops, and we are, I think, very clearly in a reinforcing feedback loop where the powerful amass more power and more money for themselves. And the New York Times published an op-ed by Ben Rhodes, who worked for the Obama administration. And he said that the U.S. system is not built to fight corruption. And then he talks a lot about Trump's corruption, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, I would argue that our system in the United States of lobbies and lobbying is actually encouraging corruption. Like, it is part of the system, as opposed to encouraging is not even the right word. It's part of the system. It's baked in. So where do you see opportunities to disrupt this cycle? Because I know you've worked in local governments, and I know that there are always competing interests for different outcomes.
Yeah, well, in any system, what happens is always the result of the balance of all the feedback loops. So there are some feedback loops that are steering the system toward transparency, equity, justice, the rule of law. So voting is a feedback loop, right? And if it is a strong feedback loop, then everyone's vote counts equally. Everyone has the same access to exercise their vote. And of course, we know those feedback loops have been weakened, right? Depending on your wealth and your race, how easy it is to just access your polling space is different. Based on redistricting, whether your vote has the same weight as another vote. But still, civil rights is a balancing feedback loop, a counterweight to that tendency for power to bring more power to itself. The press is a balancing feedback loop, right? When whistleblowers can say this is happening and it's not right and people can find out about it. And so we know that that's been weakening with consolidation of media. And now as information streams get muddied by disinformation from various ways, it's seriously weakening that feedback loop. So I guess to answer your question, I think it's to find one of those feedback loops where you think you can make a difference, right? Can you work on voting rights in your community? Can you help support financially independent journalism? Those feedback loops, they're not gone yet and they can be strengthened, and it's our actions that strengthen them.
Yeah, thank you. Well, in this context, I want to ask you about solidarity. You said, I'm going to quote you here, that solidarity is a lubricant for change. And if we're going to take action in one of these feedback loops, how do you think about solidarity within these loops?
Yeah, a lot of what I've thought about by that was really influenced by a thinker, Rihanna Gunn Wright, who was one of the thinkers behind the Green New Deal. You know, the Green New Deal, a lot of people are like, well, it's not just about green stuff. Like, there's childcare in that. Why is there childcare in the Green New Deal? There's job training for women. Like, what's that in there for? And what she said was, if we need to reorient our whole economy really quickly away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy, people aren't going to be able to move if their health insurance is tied to a job in the fossil fuel system. But if we all had universal health care and that safety net, workers could shift at the speed that we need. Same thing for childcare, right? Like, if we want to have enough people joining this new workforce to do this very big job, we need to think about what keeps people from being able to change. So her thinking kind of opened my eyes toward that, toward solidarity and a social safety net actually allowing a society to be more nimble and change more quickly. Another example where I think we saw that was in the beginning of the pandemic, when what we needed was for people to change a lot of behaviors because it wasn't necessarily safe for people to gather in the ways that we had. And in places where there was a social safety net so that people could still have a paycheck, even if they didn't go to their job in a restaurant or a coffee shop. So a safety net means workers aren't going to work when they're sick, right? If you don't have a safety net, workers are, and that's a whole society-wide problem. It's going to increase the rate at which this new disease that we're trying to cope with is spreading. So just those are a couple examples where when you start to widen your picture of the whole system, you actually see that's an investment for everyone that allows a society to be more responsive. And when things are changing so quickly with climate change and other threats accelerating, like that nimbleness is something we really need.
We'll be right back with Beth, so stick around. I promise you will love this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, I want to share about a podcast called Risky Business.
I'm Nate Silver.
And I'm Maria Konnikova. We're journalists who moonlight as high-stakes poker players. And on our podcast, Risky Business, we bring an analytical lens, thinking about odds, incentives, and outcomes to the choices shaping our democracy.
Because every move in politics is a calculation, and sometimes our leaders can make bad bets.
You don't say, Nate. If you want to understand what our politicians are thinking and what's at stake with each decision they make, this show is for you.
Listen to Risky Business wherever you get your podcasts.
And now, let's return to my conversation with Elizabeth Sawin. One takeaway from your book and from what you just said is that worldviews do change and behaviors do change. So even though it seems that we are powerless in the face of, big corporate interests or corrupt politicians, say, we can affect change and we can make a change within the system. You just mentioned the safety net and the Green New Deal, and a lot of climate activism is really about politics. I think we can agree that the climate crisis continues largely because of the lack of political will as opposed to the science or even the funds. I've seen some numbers. I'm like, that's actually so affordable. Why are we not doing this? So when I was reading your book, I thought to myself, well, if we solve for climate, maybe we will also solve for democracy. If we solve for world hunger, we will also solve for democracy. And as you think about this, since you're an expert, how do you think about democracy in the larger context of most of your work in climate?
Yeah, often I've actually thought that at first sounds like the opposite of what you're proposing. I've looked back at my own career focused on climate and then on multi-solving and sort of thought, if I could have a do-over and I really want to protect the climate, I would work on voting rights and democracy. And my reason for thinking that is study after study that shows that the same groups of people who have the most barriers to voting are also the strongest climate advocates. And so that's immigrants, it's working people, people of color. And it's not really surprising. Like, communities at the margins are the ones that experience climate impacts first, and they have the least amount of buffer and safety and protection. So they're kind of an early warning in a way. And so if those people are also systematically constrained from influencing collective governance, that's a reason society moves slower than it should. And, I look back at the climate movement where people would agree that democracy is an issue, but they'd often say, but the climate is a crisis and we'll have time to take care of democracy later, or racial justice. Yes, that's a problem, but we'll have time to take care of that once we've solved this climate problem. So just that bias in thinking, I think, is part of what's led us here, but it's also never too late to learn from that. The climate crisis is deeper than it ever has been, but I don't think that changes anything about needing to unite that struggle with the struggle for civil and human rights and see them as the same issue in so many ways.
Oh, yeah, of course they are, right? It's really an issue of equity, like you said, that the populations, the communities that are directly affected by climate change or by pollution are normally the people who have the least voice and the least power. And if we could change the power problem, then we could have different kinds of actions. So for most of us, multisolving doesn't seem obvious. I think it's always easier to understand a concept through storytelling. So what's a story that you like to share if you want people to start thinking about multisolving? What are the most important components to start multisolving? And from your own experience, what's a how-to?
Well, I agree. Multisolving definitely translates best in stories. And for that reason, on our website, which is multisolving.org, we have a lot of case studies of multisolving. You mentioned in your intro, one of the ways my colleagues and I have worked is to look for the bright spots, because although multisolving is hard, it exists everywhere, and trying to understand not only what people accomplished, but how, what ways of working together. And when you look across those case studies, which are from all over the world and different scales, one thing that has impacted me is noticing how many of those cases were a response to a crisis. And I mentioned that today because in the summer of 2025, there's such a sense of crisis. So one example that has its roots in crisis like that we looked at, it was from New Zealand, and it was a response to the economic crisis of 2008, 2009. And it started with the government being worried about the construction sector in a slowdown and the impact on jobs. And so they set up a program to weatherize and improve the energy efficiency of residential homes across New Zealand. And it worked in the sense that it provided jobs in the construction sector. It also reduced the energy demand of those homes. So it was a energy and climate program. So there you have multi-solving, right? You have jobs, energy, climate. It saved money for the people living in those homes. So they had more money for food and medicine and education because they weren't spending it on energy as much. But then the fascinating thing to me was they looked at the health of the people living in those homes, and they saw reduced visits to the emergency department and reduced medication costs. And that was the result of living in healthier housing. And so in the next round of the program, the public health sector got involved, and they actually set it up so doctors could refer patients for these home energy tune-ups. And so you have a response to one crisis, a jobs crisis, ended up actually helping with a climate crisis and a health crisis. And so stories like that, and that's just one, tell me that if you have this web of relationship worldview, you can start anywhere and notice that it leads almost everywhere. But you have to pay attention in a different way. You have to be asking what else is getting better. Otherwise, you wouldn't notice that health impact. And you have to be willing to partner with groups that you might not normally work with. Like, it's not typical for doctors to prescribe home energy tune-ups, right? That's a change in expanding like what the definition of a doctor is and what you prescribe. In terms of how to go about it, part of what we say is just start where you are. And a really good question to ask is, how does the solution to what I'm really worried about also offer a solution to what other people are worried about? And you might not know the answer to that at first. So you have to listen and you have to be curious. Things that get in the way are too much attachment to your own expertise. So people need to bring their expertise into multi-solving, but they need to be the kind of experts who are really curious about what they don't know and how what they know fits with what other people know.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. But also in this time and place, the year 2025, I think there is a lot of skepticism around expertise writ large. You know, there is not even a willingness to look at the expert and just go with your gut feeling and your vibes. I feel like a lot of the Trump administration is running on vibes, and that's definitely not systems thinking. It's definitely not multi-solving. And I think it is making the problems with our democracy more acute. Like the fact that we are so powerless, the evidence of our powerlessness is all around us, right? Whether that's the lack of action on climate or the continuing trajectory of police brutality 5 years after the murder of George Floyd, or the interminable wars that the United States keeps funding around the world. And so one question I have here is about steering, because you say don't worry about starting small because hopefully if you have the right idea, it's going to catch on. It's a reinforcing feedback loop. But as you think about steering in sort of like this juggernaut of the United States, how do you think about like, okay, if I take this action, it can steer in the direction where I want to go, where I think we should go?
As things become more and more uncertain and more destabilized, and likely that's true for the rest of our lives. Like, I don't think we're just in some little moment.
Oh, no, yes. I agree.
Right?
This is continuing.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah, this is the situation. I mean, the human economy has been in overshoot of the Earth system's capacity to support it since 1988. Like, we are far into destabilization. So we should expect uncertainty. We should expect needing to improvise. And honestly, I think we should try wherever we can to let go of that need for certainty about anything, how it's all going to turn out. If anyone tells me they know how it's going to turn out, I tend to, write them off. I don't think that is possible in a situation like this. And also letting go of certainty that we're going to know that what we do matters or even was in the right direction. So I don't think that means you stop making plans. I don't think it means you stop thinking strategically. But I think instead you find these points that are anchors. And the ones that I write about in my book, one is vision. So what is the world that you want to see? And envisioning, the hardest but most important thing is to not be constrained by what you believe is possible. So it has to be in line with physical laws, right? It's not a useful vision if you're like, oh, we're all going to live on sunlight and not need food. That's not what I'm suggesting. But don't be constrained because you believe people will never change or no one will ever listen, right? Those things are not fixed physical laws. So really let yourself imagine the just and equitable and sustainable either village, city, world that you want to live in. And what all my teachers in systems thinking say is that when you do that, there's something that happens where you see the moments to steer toward that possibility, or you take the leaps. And I've put this into practice in my own life a few times in a way that looking back is kind of startling. One was when I was a new parent. My husband and I had our first daughter, and we got offered a job that was a 50% pay cut with 6 months job security. We also had our first mortgage. But we had about a year before done a visioning of the kind of work we wanted to do and the place we wanted to live. And this offer lined up with that beautifully. And so we said yes. I mean, I look back at those brave new parents who took that leap, and it changed everything about my work and where I lived and where our kids grew up. And it turned out to move me a lot closer to what I wanted. And I think if we hadn't, my husband and I both, taken that time to envision what we wanted, we either wouldn't have seen this as the opportunity or it would have seemed too scary. So something about setting your sights on what you want helps prepare you for those moments when the possibility arises. And I think that's just more important than ever as things get more tumultuous. There are these moments that appear, and do we leap into them or not? Well, knowing where you want to go and where you want to see the world go makes that easier.
Thank you for sharing that story. That was really brave to take a pay cut and move with a baby and be young. It's very impressive. So what's the second anchor point?
A second anchor point that I talk about in the book is values. If we're aiming for more and more to inhabit that web of relationships worldview, what are the values? Like, what does that come down to in your own life? I listen respectfully to other points of view. I share power in my organization. Like, they can become very concrete, and they can be the same values you want to see in the wider society. And practicing them wherever you can, I think, is an antidote to that powerlessness you're talking about, which is a little bit of an illusion. We don't have the power to change everything, but we all change everything all the time by being nodes in an interconnected system. So in these little moments, like how I lead my organization, how do I try to walk the talk on racial justice in our policy, in our very small organization. I haven't changed the world, but there's a lot to think about in doing this. And it's culture change. And I've learned some things, and I've hopefully built some muscles so that in other places I have something to draw on. So it's not values as a abstract exercise that you write about in your journal. You might start there, but it is a moment to moment kind of practice. And we don't know the way those even small actions can ripple. A question that I ask a lot is, think of a time where you found out about a ripple of impact of something that you've done. And so when I ask people this, the stories are so beautiful, right? Like, well, I had an employee 25 years ago, and I encouraged her to finish her college degree. And I just ran into her now 2 decades later, and like she explained the trajectory of her career and her advanced degree and organizations she'd founded and the people she helped. And I can see that moment rippled out in so many ways. And for every of those moments we find out about, think about how many we're never going to know. That passing moment where we were courageous in a group and spoke the truth. You don't know how that changed other people. So I think power is a continuum, and we see it as black and white in the society. Like, either I have the power to change everything or I'm powerless. You can see where the forces of the status quo might like you to believe that, right?
Yes.
Because we're all going to decide we're powerless.
Yeah.
And if there is a self-fulfilling prophecy, that's the one.
Right.
I'm powerless. Yep, you'll be right if that's what you believe.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered, to your point, and ignite collective change. For listeners who want to start practicing multisolving in their own communities, what's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us just now into action?
Well, one action that I'm really so pleased when I see it happen is around the world, people are buying together or getting their library to order my book, Multisolving, and they're reading it together. And one of my visions in writing the book was that by reading the book within an organization or a community, people would be starting to build those webs of interconnection that we've been talking about, the ones that are required for multi-solving. In this time when people feel isolated, pick a day of the week and somebody's porch and get a bunch of your friends and neighbors together, talk about that book or talk about another book. This is actually less about my book and more about gathering together to feel less alone and less isolated.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, last question. Looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
An interesting thing, I've been working on climate change my whole career. Now is approaching 30 years. And I'm more hopeful now than I ever was, which surprises people when I say that because things are dire. And I think hope and things being dire can coexist. But I'm hopeful because of the number of people who are activated and the number of connections being made, including the connections across issue areas. So climate used to be very insular, and with environmental justice really being the thought leaders of the climate movement at this point, I think that's behind us. The sheer numbers of people and their ability to connect issues, I think is just an untapped force for change, and it gives me a lot of hope.
Yeah, thank you. Here. I really think that this conversation was really hopeful about embracing complexity, embracing uncertainty, and having hope nonetheless, and believing that we have power. Thank you very much, Beth, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Elizabeth Sawin is the director of Multisolving Institute and the author of Multisolving, Creating Systems Change in a Fractured World. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Learn about multisolving and do it in a group. Whether that's reading Beth's book together or discussing the process for systems change, find a way to be curious as a collective. Connecting is step one. Next week on Future Hindsight, we're joined by Alec Karakatsanis. He's the founder and executive director of the Civil Rights Corps and the author of Propaganda, How Police and the Media Manipulate Our News.
Propaganda has us focused on a very narrow range of harms that are supposedly perpetrated by poor people, people of color, immigrants, and strangers.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, be sure to follow us on your podcast app so you'll never miss an episode. We are your resource for all the tools you need to stay engaged. So follow Future Hindsight now, and we'll come right to you every week. And if you want to support Future Hindsight and all the work that we do as an independent, pro-democracy podcast, join the Civics Club on Patreon. Head to patreon.com/futurehindsight now to join. Thanks for tuning in. And until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack, Travis, and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.